Osborne has been at the forefront of efforts for over 100 years, as you said, but more recently and during your 30-year tenure to raise the voice of families, especially children in the sentencing process. What have been some of the challenges that you have faced in this work, and just how have you addressed these challenges?
Well, I think one what references this sort of belief that fathers in particular, if they're incarcerated, don't really have a lot, or they're running up against the law, don't have a lot to contribute. And and I've tried to respond, and partly just our own experience was that my children's father was a central figure in their lives. At the same time, that was partly because I had the financial resources and family support to be able to drive 10 hours for the visits. I probably spent more in collect calls than Glenn owed in child support, which was a lot of money that I was able to do. So, part of the challenge is how generally we view low-income children of color and the relationship with their fathers more generally, and how that's affected. And you can see the difference. You remember when Enron happened, and there was a married couple, both went to prison, and they went out of their way to make sure that they didn't serve their sentences at the same time so that the children's lives should not be disrupted. That generally doesn't happen for most of our kids, where there's an assumption, right, that mother and that father, despite the fact that they had bilked hundreds of thousands of people out of billions of dollars, that somehow that didn't have anything to do with whether they would be good moral parents or not. But for the people that we serve, there's this assumption, a different assumption. So that's a huge challenge, is that. Secondly is people don't really understand the trauma involved in separating a child from a parent, and what attachment really is, and what the impact of that is. And when they do think about it, they go very quickly to this idea that they're going to become, that they're little criminals in waiting. And people push, frankly, crappy research to try to support that view. And all that does is, I remember back when my son was in school, anytime anything went missing, oh, it must have been him because his dad's in prison. And all of these kinds of assumptions about these kids. There's another bad challenge we have, which is that people often think that for these kids in these neighborhoods, prison is just a rite of passage. They're really not stigmatized by their parents going to prison. So there are so many kinds of views you have to break down to get to this point of thinking that you're going to ask a probation officer to inquire about the person's family support and why that would be important. So I think the invisibility of the issue, the stigma that goes along with it, the view that in general these dads and moms don't have much to contribute have been the biggest challenges. And also, frankly, we talk to probation officers, and I'm talking specifically about the family impact statement here in terms of asking them to ask questions, and we actually have the samples of what we use in New York. And asking those questions is also just actually extra work for people who are already feel a little bit besieged by having to do these pre-sentence investigations. So I think that the way you do it and the way that Allison Hallahan from Osborne and the people working on the initiative is almost one probation officer at a time, and to begin to accept when they said we want to reframe this as responsibility for those reasons. We were like, fine, call it a restaurant menu. We don't really care, but just kind of do it. So those were some of the ways we've worked with those challenges. The other thing that's so important is young people like Dalton and my daughter and other kids that we work with in our youth advisory work. When they went to Albany to talk about proximity in sentencing and family impact statements and child-sensitive arrest, like the next day, legislation was introduced because they were able to speak as people directly affected. And so that was another way we've been able to deal with the challenges, just put voices forward that can speak truly about their experience. And children's voices need to be lifted up.
Okay. Thank you. I think, Glenn, you wanted to respond before we open it up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something brief. So I never like to make assumptions about my audience, right? So I'd like to believe that everyone in the audience sort of cares about the framing that we're using here, which is, to us, very important, the idea of keeping families together and so on. That may not be true, but they also may have to explain some of this stuff to other people who may not sort of get it so easily. And so I want to just add a slightly different frame to the conversation, which is the fact that we've created a criminal justice system that has consumed so many people and families and individuals that it's almost like a maze where there's like many ways in, only one way through prison and no way out. And so I want people to think about it also as a system, right? And how the system operates the way it does because it's so large at this point. And it doesn't do individualized assessments because that just takes too much time when you're dealing with millions of people. And yet, I think that if we're going to talk about paradigm shift, we need to get back to the point where we're doing individualized assessments. So part of this conversation is about how to encourage decision makers to go back to recognizing that there's a human being standing in front of them, and that human being is connected to so many other human beings. I mean, I think about, by way of drawing an analogy, I think about doctors and how many years of schooling they go to and residency and all these different things. And then what they do is you walk into their office and the first thing they say to you is, "What's wrong?" or "What's hurting," right? It's a very sort of individualized conversation as opposed to, "I know all these things and I'm going to make a decision." And so that's part of the conversation for people here who have to turn around and go explain this to someone else. And maybe the family conversation is more difficult to have because people start out saying, well, he or she should have thought about that when they made the decision. I just want to offer sort of a different framing that hopefully can help you have this discussion around individualized determinations.